Bloody Elbow presents the Hey, Not the Face podcast. Your host is Bloody Elbow's chief financial columnist, John Nash.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and me, your producer, Steffi Haynes. Now, John, what's our topic today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about the all-important topic of pro wrestling and MMA, the connection, the links between pro wrestling, mixed martial arts, and between the WWF, WWE, whatever you kids call it today, and the UFC.
And whose idea was it to go for this topic?
Anybody you want to spread the blame around, it goes right to you. All the complaints should be directed towards you.
And this is true because we got into a conversation right after we recorded the last episode, and it was so intense about WWE and how it links up with MMA that we decided that should be the next episode. And so I'm looking forward to this one. I've watched pro wrestling since I was a kid, even though lately I've kind of gotten out of it. I just go way, way back, just like you. When you were a kid, I'm sure you watched pro wrestling too. So this is kind of near and dear to me old heart.
Yeah, I mean, I was a big pro wrestling fan as a kid. I stopped watching around, I guess, late 80s, but I was like, if you ask me, I can tell you everything about Nick Bockwinkel, about Bobby Heenan and the AWA, about the Road Warriors, the Freebird, you can go back, the Crusher. All these figures are really loom large in my imagination. And I've always had an interest in earlier pro wrestling from the era when I was a kid and earlier. And people might not realize that before I started covering the finances of MMA, I did a lot of coverage on the early history of mixed martial arts. When I mean early history, I don't mean 1993 at the UFC 1. I mean 1905 with Salvatore's versus jiu-jitsu judo experts.
See, there we go. So John is well-versed in this. Very, very well-versed. I also put out some feelers to our good friend Jonathan Snowden, who many of you know is pretty much the authority of all things pro wrestling.
Wait, that guy has any knowledge of pro wrestling? Really? Really?
Indeed. And so I did get some comments from him that I'll be interspersing along with this segment. So without any further ado, John, I'm going to go ahead and kick off our first question, if that's all right.
Go ahead. Let's
all right, here we go. Why do some people say that MMA is just pro wrestling? Tell me the link between the two.
Well, because MMA really is pro wrestling. I don't think many fans are aware that the early mixed martial arts at UFC 1, when it started, that it was really the descendant of pro wrestling. And I'll kind of explain it for a second, is that if you go back to the early 20th century, or late 19th century, there were all these styles of wrestling that they were matching against each other to prove the best. But then Japanese judokas started coming to the West, and they started demonstrating the efficiency, the quality of their combat style, mostly judo, they called it at the time, even though jiu-jitsu, it's interchangeable back then, Kodokan judo. But they were demonstrating it and would often challenge boxers and wrestlers. Well, what happened is that the wrestling promoters at the time, the pro wrestling promoters, started staging events where judo fighters and not mixed martial arts, but pro catch-can wrestlers mostly would compete against each other in these mixed competitions, and they'd start merging the rules. Eventually, those rules for mixed combats that took place often in the early part of the 20th century, and probably a good majority of them were probably real combat, not worked at the time, although plenty of them were probably worked. Those became the rules after World War I, when pro wrestling became fake. I shouldn't say pro wrestling became fake. I don't want to say before World War I it wasn't fake. I guess it wasn't fake, but we call it fixed. In other words, the matches were presented as real matches before World War I, but they're often fraudulent matches. They were fixed for the betting. But after World War I, it became a purely entertainment, and the rules they used for pro wrestling, which they still use today, were the rules of those mixed matches, where you have these submissions, where you have striking, where you have all these other things that go together, a mixed fight, and that became pro wrestling. And so early 20th century combat, early century mixed fights, MMA, basically those pro wrestling events at the time were mixed fights, and we're just continuing them today.
What were the rule sets like? I mean, did they have rules, referees, judges? How did all of that work?
Well, they did, but often, I mean, there was all different versions. The most common was something, no holds barred, as we know today. They'd call matches no holds barred. But those were also often grappling matches. In other words, the holds that were banned in a lot of wrestling matches, like the full Nelson, because people get their neck broken in a full Nelson, or strangleholds would be allowed. But then there were other matches similar called anything go matches. And they had some other names to them, too. Later, they became like all-in wrestling. But anything go matches were pretty much that anything goes. And you're allowed to punch and kick. And in some of them, they could headbutt. There's a famous match where a guy beat a judo expert by headbutting him constantly because the rules allowed for it, because it was anything goes.
Wow. So how did it become real again with MMA then?
Well, with MMA, there's two paths. And so it became real with the most obvious one is in Japan. They took that fake all-in wrestling, and all-in wrestling is basically the rule set they had at the time, where you had regular wrestling, the pin, but submissions, and you could punch and kick. So open fist punching, you remember, it was slapping. You couldn't punch a guy in pro wrestling, and they brought that to Japan. It became very popular. And post World War Japan, it was extremely popular. But they treated it very serious. They kept the illusion, much more than America, that those were real events. People viewed them as real sporting events, and they pushed that so hard that later, when Inoki, who just passed away, Tony Inoki, was trying to promote his pro wrestling as being the best, he started doing a series of mixed matches, and he probably got that idea from something called Heroes in the Ring in Brazil. But he did these mixed matches, him versus different martial arts. And later, kind of his pupils, the next line of students, the promoter started bringing in the best catch-can wrestlers from the West. Guys like Billy Robinson and Carl Gotch. Those guys taught real pro wrestling, the real catch-can, submission grappling rules to the Japanese. And the wrestlers who were treated so serious, they started thinking, we want to do this for real. And so a martial art first sprung up, Shudo started, which was very similar to pro wrestling, but also different. But then finally, Pancrase came around. And Pancrase, all was we are going to do the shoot style pro wrestling, but for real. And that came out several months before the UFC. And so you had real pro wrestling in Japan done at, as first as kind of a show, but then they became more and more sports-like, and that gave birth to rings, and eventually the biggest of them, Pride.
I was wondering if you were going to get rings in there, and you did. Now, is there a connection between pro wrestling and the UFC, though?
There's just as strongest connection between UFC and pro wrestling as Pancrase and the Japanese pro wrestling. Japanese kept the pro wrestling style and spectacle more than the UFC. But at the first UFC event, the LA Critic was there, talked about how it was from a sport in Brazil known as mixed martial arts. And mixed martial arts, what he was referring to, obviously, was Vale Tudo, the Gracie challenges in Brazil. And so when we talk about, there's always these stories that mixed martial arts was coined in the 90s. No, the term mixed martial arts comes from much earlier than that. In fact, it probably came from Antonio Inoki in Japan, and WWE or WWF at the time in the 70s started repeating it, and that's where it spread through the UFC. The Howard Rosenberg from the LA Times got the term. But Vale Tudo in Brazil, these anything go matches, if you go back further, they came from the Gracie family. Where did the Gracie family get it from? Japanese judokas who had gone to the West, competed in pro wrestling, and brought that style to Brazil and competed in these mixed matches in Brazil. In fact, one of them, Matsuya Maeda, also known as Count Combat in the English for his translation of his nickname, Konde Koma. he taught the legend is he taught the Gracie family. How much he actually taught them is a question, but he did, he started them on the path to judo jiu-jitsu. He taught them, and they picked up the anything goes, and anything goes. Vale tudo means anything goes in Portuguese. So they're just recreating the anything go fights from America and Europe in Brazil. They continued it down to the day, brought it to America. And so the same pro wrestling anything go matches from the early part of the 20th century is what the UFC is.
What about their business models? How close are they linked business-wise? Because when I was speaking with John Snowden, one of the first things he said that defines WWE from the UFC is the length of career of the primaries. For WWE, that would be the wrestlers, and for the UFC, that would be the fighters. And he said that WWE careers are much, much longer. A fighter in the UFC has a super short window. So bearing that in mind, let's look at business aspects of it. Tell us about that.
Well, a big reason it went fake or was fixed in the beginning, the reason that the pro wrestling became fake, one reason it's easier to fake pro wrestling is grappling matches. It's harder to tell when you fake it compared to boxing. Boxing had a lot of fraudulent fixed matches, but they're harder to fake a punch to the face than it is a hold that puts a guy in pain, right? Mm-hmm. And forces him to go to the ground to either submit or get pinned. So that was one. But the other reason is the people that ran it, the top wrestlers, obviously wanted to elongate their careers. If it's based on actual skill and athleticism, then the younger guys are going to win. But if you can make it fake and keep the audience unknown, your careers extend. And so that's probably a big reason why pro wrestling became a much more fraudulent fake sport, because it elongated the stars' careers. And because combat sport work on the principle you have to beat the best to be the best. In other words, you have to beat the man to be the man. Mm. The guy holding the belt can stay at top as long as he controls and puts people around him to protect him. And that's where the idea of the policeman came in pro wrestling. And a policeman were other wrestlers that were good at it, but they kept away people that could challenge you for the title. So if you're really good and you're like, I want to fight the best, they would make you fight these guys, and they would do the worst things possible to basically ruin your career, cheat, gouge, just beat you to hell to get you in line, but also to block you from fighting the champion that they were protecting. And so where if you started getting different from boxing is there was some of this in boxing, but boxing, because of the corruption stuff, the states got involved in the titles. We had the police gazetteer created a title, but in boxing, eventually the New York City State Athletic Commission, the NYSAC, sanctioned the boxing titles. And so you had this independent body saying, we determine who's fighting for the title, and it became harder to defend that title from other boxers. That happened to pro wrestling too. By the end of the 20s, 29, the New York State Athletic Commission started sanctioning pro wrestling titles. And then in 1930, the NBA, the National Boxing Association, created a wrestling title, the NWA. And so you had these independent titles, and there actually is a wave in the early 30s of shoot matches, real wrestling matches, where people are probably trying to take these titles. But it was defeated quickly because promoter Paul Bowser created his own association, the AWA, and created his own title. And that's how pro wrestling got around compared to boxing, is the promoters, first the AWA, the first AWA in 1930, there was a later one with Vern Gagne in 1960, then the National Wrestling Alliance, a group of promoters got together and made a cartel, but they controlled the title themselves. They made these fake sanctioning organizations to keep it in-house. And you can see that today with MMA. The promotions follow the box. They don't follow the boxing model where there's an outside body determining the number one challenger. They follow the pro wrestler model, pro wrestling, where the company owns their title and determines who gets to challenge for the belt.
And then the UFC lobbies and greases palms or does whatever they need to keep commissions from reporting their payouts.
Well, yeah, that too.
I'm sorry, I just had to throw that in there because the UFC seems to have a lot of sway with a lot of commissions. So, all right, let's talk about UFC versus WWE as a business. The UFC and WWE are compared to each other all the time, ad nauseum. And both are the 800-pound gorillas in their industry, for lack of a better term. So are there similarities in how they got to that position?
Well, there are some similarities. There's differences because, like we said, stars last longer in the WWE. They're created themselves by the WWE or WWF. I'm going to call them WWF. I grew up in a WWF world, so it's just easier for me to call them the WWF. I don't even know what the WWE is, but stars are created by them. So we're in MMA. As much as you control your titles rankings, you still have to win in the cage. So there's less control on that side. There's more risk involved in the wrestling on the promoter side. But they both followed a similar path in that, in fact, the WWF probably laid the groundwork that the UFC was following, because the WWF came in and Vince McMahon, as most people know, in the 70s, he had the idea of expanding it into a national promotion. At the time, America was cut up in the old territories, basically from their old carny, almost mob days of wrestling. But he came in, used his base in New York, and went in and either acquired promotions to acquire their talent and territory, or put them out of business by challenging them directly. And I mean, you look at that and you go, well, that's the UFC model, because when the UFC got on top and money started coming in, what do? They acquired the rivals to take them off the board in WEC and Pride and Strikeforce, or they went directly off after them and made life so hellish for them that they couldn't compete until finally they controlled the industry. And so they both did that, and both of them are basically monopolies in the industry. Both of them offer, and what control, like I get UFC's controls like 90% of the market. I wouldn't be shocked if for big portions of the WWF's career in the last 10, 20, 30 years, that they've had 90% of the market.
One of the things that Snowden also said, that conceptually, the two companies are pretty different. He said that even as Vince's wife took a job in the Trump administration and ran as a Republican, you didn't really feel that as a palpable feeling in the WWE, the way that you feel a certain political sway, a political leaning in the UFC. WWE company was doing lots of anti-bullying work and charity stuff, whereas it feels like the UFC has taken an intentional step towards being the anti-woke sports league. Those words are from Jonathan Snowden. What's your take on that?
A few years ago, I would disagree. And I don't think a few years ago he would have written that. But you do see in the last few years, they have embraced the idea that they are, anti-woke, that they are not PC, that they have embraced kind of the right-wing politicians, the Trump mega crowd. And that, I think that's undeniable, that seems to be I want to say it's 100% a game, because it's obviously they have people like, the head of it, Ari Emanuel, is tight with a lot of the Democratic Party, although I don't know how tight he is anymore with the Democratic Party leadership. But, and they're not fully on board, but they're reaching out and have some links to them. And a lot of the fighters obviously, hold those political views. So it's not like they're going against the wishes of their athletes.
Do they practice a similar business model, though?
Yeah, I would say they do, because one of the first things Lorenzo Fertitta did when he bought the UFC from the original owners, the previous owners, SEG, is he said he went out and got all the financials from the WWF at the time and looked them over to compare it. And you look at it now, WWF, their business is different now than it was a few years. But if you look at the tough years, the peak years, it seems very similar in the sense that they ran weekly shows, built up stars and personalities, and then ran pay-per-views on top of that, right? Mm-hmm. So that very similar model in the sense the way they played. Now it's different in the sense that with the UFC, with pro wrestling, you can run the same stars week in, week out because they don't get hurt. They get hurt. It's real in the sense that there's physically grinding, but not the sense where you cannot compete week after week like you can in real fighting. In UFC, you can't show up week after week and fight. Your body won't take it. But you can do that in the WWF. So there's that difference between the two. But basic model was we're going to run weekly shows to advertise on a network platform. And at the beginning of the UFC, it was Spike, and then build up towards a pay-per-view basically every month to sell. They also follow similar models in that they both employ independent contractors, right? And so, I mean, and for the WWF, it's absurd to me that they're independent contractors. The amount of control they have, they're not just doing the one showing up for fight week and doing a fight. They're driving around the country doing show after show after show, week after week. And to me, it's very absurd that those guys are viewed as independent contractors. But both employ independent contractors. Both lay a lot of the costs on their talent. Both then, because they're independent contractors, don't have to deal with unions or the athletes being band together and collectively bargain. And they also, neither one of them because it's fake, and the other one because it didn't have the legislation and history that boxing did. Neither one has to deal with the regulations that boxing has to deal with. There's no Ali Act being enforced on either one of these. And so they have on that sense, they have a very similar model where they can extract as much as possible out of their talent that other sports, I use sports in quotations. I know pro wrestling's not a sport, but it pretends to be. It's an illusion of a sport. But they can extract from their athletes that other sports can never do.
You mentioned the Ali Act. Wasn't there some sort of an antitrust suit that happened in wrestling, though?
Yeah, we talked about this previously. There was an antitrust suit filed in boxing against the IBC of New York, which was controlled boxing that controlled the championship titles. Now, they were going to file another suit, antitrust lawsuit at the time, against the NWA, National Wrestling Alliance, for being a cartel, and it was obviously a cartel. But what killed it is they're putting their energy in the IBC of New York, and when they met with them, they were told, basically, this is fake. We are faking the matches. And when they heard that they're fake, they didn't think there was the case. It was worth bringing the case forward because it's like, well, it's fake. It's not real. These aren't real sports where they're denying athletes a chance. But what it did set up is that pro wrestling then, there was no history of regulation on the sense of the titles that you cannot, it's a restraint on trade to deny people a chance at the championship because the champion is fake in pro wrestling. But it laid this groundwork where the promotions, because after that, the AWA created their own belt, WWF created their own titles. There's probably a link between that and all these promotions in pro wrestling creating their own titles. And that set the groundwork, the example that MMA followed in the future.
Another similarity that gets thrown around a lot is how both companies control the narrative around them. Is that an accurate comparison?
Yeah, that is, because in other sports, you notice like the NFL exerts a lot of control over their product, but they sell the product to, the broadcaster, NBC or CBS or Fox. They hire their own crew. They do their own broadcast, their own coverage. With pro wrestling, WWF, and with UFC, they control. They hire the camera people. They hire the announcers. They have the editors. They control the content they put out there. There's no third party commenting on the product, what's being put on the cage or ring. So they control that. They also have their own self-contained universes, as you know. And if you're in the WWF or WWE now, they're famous for not talking about the champions of other promotions or where they came from before. In fact, if you come into the WWF as a kid, one of the worst things was seeing what they done to one of the wrestlers you like and the new gimmick they gave them so that they could control the gimmick. They often have a copyright on that gimmick. They'd bring him in and then it'd be a lame gimmick. It wouldn't be the same person that you remembered before. And they have this control because the person they're making only exists in the world. If that pro wrestler then leaves the WWF, then that gimmick stays behind or doesn't have the same impact because you can't keep the name or whatever. So, and for the UFC, it's somewhat similar, is they don't often talk about other promotions. They do a little bit, but not to the level you would expect that other fighters exist out there, that it's a self-contained world and that their rankings all that matter, that they don't have to worry about outside body rankings. Their titles, their promotional titles are the world titles, and they'll claim all the time. Now, today, people will say, well, obviously the UFC champions are the best. But they were doing this back in the day when Tim Sylvia was the heavyweight champion and Fedor Emelianenko was in Pride. And no one in their right mind thought Tim Sylvia was better than him. And yet they could make that claim that our guy is the best, the best heavyweight in the world. And in a lot of weight classes, there was that same issue at the time. There was questions, but they can always claim that their guy's the best. We don't have to acknowledge anything outside.
All right. So we're gonna finish this conversation with the biggest one of all. And I want to ask the question, and then I'm going to tell you what Jonathan Snowden had to say. And basically the question is Dana White the UFC's version of Vince McMahon? And when I asked Jonathan Snowden this, he said this: Vince was not Dana. He was Lorenzo Fertitta and Dana combined into one. Also, for the last 20 or so years, after a few public missteps, Vince did almost no media that wasn't a WWE production, and that was only rarely. He was not the face of the WWE the way Dana White is the face of the UFC. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah. I think that's very accurate. I mean, Vince was Dana White and Lorenzo put together. He's Dana White, as important he is to the UFC, and he's a major figure. Vince is the true shot caller. He's the one that came up with the business plans. He came up with the strategy, the long-term strategy. He wasn't just the figurehead for the company.
So which one of them is the most effective leader of their brand?
Well,
and
I would say long-term.
Let's set aside Vince's most recent issues with all of the sex scandals and stuff like that. Let's put those aside and act like they're not there for just a moment when we make this comparison.
I mean, obviously Vince, who's been leading the WWF, now WWE, for 40 years, is the bigger figure because he was the single head of the company. He did something at a much more difficult time when there was a lot of competition. He conquered the industry. He laid the blueprint groundwork for what the UFC would do. So in that sense, he's obviously a more important figure because also, as we said before, he was Dana White and Lorenzo put together. But for purposes of the company, in many ways, Dana White might be more important for the way they use him and compared to what Vince McMahon is their figurehead. Vince McMahon was a character on the show in the 90s. They kind of didn't use him that much before that. But in the 90s, they made him a major character, a major star of the company. But it was a little late to do what they could have done with him, right? And also because of the length, the longevity of other wrestlers' careers, it's hard to displace the star power of your biggest stars because they're going to be there as well. But Dana White's not the only one. I've talked to Cardiff Garcia on his podcast, The New Bazaar, about this, that there was a trend where figureheads became very important for companies, that they started making the top of the company, the CEO or the owner, a celebrity. I mean, Steve Jobs is famous for that. And I'm not saying Steve Jobs was ripping that off from Vince McMahon, but I think there was an obvious comparison to make there in the charisma of them. But you can see Mark Cuban, I think intentionally has made himself a star. Brandon from Virgin Airlines has made himself a star. You got Elon Musk now has become the figurehead of his company, and their presence makes them more valuable for the company, but also adds value to the company. And I think it's something that a lot of companies borrowed from Vince McMahon. And I think Dana White intentionally did that. We all can remember the early days of Dana White, and then when Tough came out, how drastically his appearance changed and his mannerisms. And I think that's what they did. They saw the value. They made him in a major figurehead because in MMA, unlike pro wrestling, the fighters' careers are much shorter and they're much riskier. Mm. You can control who wins and loses in pro wrestling. You can control how long their career is going to last. You can't control who's going to lose in a legitimate match. You can kind of protect them for a little while, but that's not going to last forever. So careers, even the best careers, only last a few years. And so you can't control the narrative. So there's always the risk of a fighter leaving. So Dana White gives you the biggest star to be the face of the company, and he's there permanently. Also, unlike Vince didn't deal with outside press much. He was there as a character, but Dana White serves a purpose. He's a PI. They put him in front of all the mainstream press all the time. he speaks on behalf of the company all the time. So him being the figurehead that runs the company, this charismatic presence, and if you don't like, it doesn't matter if you like him or not. He has some charisma, obviously.
Yeah,
there's something magnetic about him for a lot of people, and so he gets to be this figure where Vince McMahon was much more the real guy that ran the company. He's the guy. I mean, famously, people complain about the storylines. Obviously, he was apparently vetoing storylines left and right. I honestly don't know how much input Dana White has in the company anymore. I think he's busy spending all his time doing the eating crap food and planning slap fests and stuff. I don't think he's out there making all the matches, and we know he's not negotiating the contracts really anymore. But he's as a figurehead, he's more valuable for the UFC. In fact, he's so valuable when they bought the company, William Morris, Endeavor now, they demanded as part of the deal that he stay on.
Yeah. And they made it a sweet pot, too, for him to stay on.
Yeah, I mean, the story is, and we don't know the full deal, but they apparently bought him out, pay him a large salary, but he's also got now equity back in the company, and he didn't put any of his own money into to get that equity.
That's right, and he had 10 or 12%. I can't remember the exact figure, if it was 10 or 12, but before the buyout, he was a 10 or 12% owner of the company. That is nothing to sneeze at.
No, he had 10% originally, and then they sold 10% to Flash Entertainment, and no, not Flash Entertainment, the Abu Dhabi United Arab Emirates company. And then so his got diluted to 9%.
Yeah, Flash was.
Oh, it was Flash. Yes.
Yeah, that was Flash. Yeah. But no, he got the 10% after that, right?
Well, he had 9% at that point. So when they sold to Endeavor, William Morris, he sold his 9% share. But I mean, they said in the earnings call there was some comment that he has shares in the company again. So I don't know what percentage he has. If they gave him back, if that was part of the deal. But he obviously has some shares. The guy has made a fortune on this.
Oh, yeah. Would you estimate that Dana is close to being a billionaire?
It's hard to say, but it matters what he invested in. If he has the percentage back to what it was, then definitely, because he made his $300 million on the sale, right? Over $300 million. He's made tens of million before that every year, basically. And now if he's back to 9% it wouldn't be that much, but let's say it's even half that of Endeavor, that's $500 million worth. So yeah, you'd guess he's probably a billionaire at this point then.
Amazing. And Dana is basically your WWE guy. He's your WWE star because he's the one that doesn't fight. He doesn't get injured. He's there for the long haul. He's shooting all this stuff. His name is all over everything. He's our WWE guy.
You know what? I didn't think of that, but he is. He's the pro wrestler in the promotion. He is the biggest. He's The Rock. He's Stone Cold. I'm trying to think. Those are the only new guys I know.
And he's Vince McMahon too.
He's very much, he's the Crusher and the Bruiser back from my days. So he's all those figures put together. He's Gary Hart from the WCCC, the Texas promotion. I can't remember their name right now. But so that's him. You're right. That's 100% him. He is when we're talking about pro wrestling, there's no one more pro wrestling probably than Dana White.
And how would you paint Ari Emanuel? Because Ari Emanuel is a very important person at Endeavor. And in general, I mean, Entourage is basically centered around his life. So how does he fit in this WWE overlay with the UFC? Does he have a role at all, or is it just basically the company and Dana White and Vince McMahon?
Well, he's more the Ted Turner, back when Ted Turner got involved, that he's the wealthy businessman outside of it who has a personality of his own, but is not hands-on to the promotion. That I would describe him as that, because his interest is not being known as he doesn't want to be known as the UFC guy. His interest is being this major player in industry, and UFC is just being a part of it, a small part of that.
And he seems to like to be the chess master, too, because when his brother was heavily involved in politics, I don't know if he still is, but when his brother was heavily involved in politics, he seemed to be operating lots of campaign trails and stuff like that and funding them and so on and so forth. So he seems to like to pull the strings too.
Well, I mean, everybody in this industry has their hands firmly into politics, and the sad part is that there's a lot of corruption in our country, a lot of revolving doors between business and politics, and a lot of money from politics going into business. But the Fertittas did the same. Remember, they constantly were raising money, lobbying, and they were the ones, even when they were talking about expanding the Ali Act for boxing back in 2009, they were lobbying to prevent that, even though MMA had no part in that expansion of the Ali Act. They did not want to expand the authority of that legislation, because what happens then if MMA is incorporated later?
Yeah, and they campaigned heavily. Who was the guy that was always there? Sheldon Silver.
Yes, with in New York.
Yes, with New York, but wasn't that over the culinary union? There was a lot of they were at odds a lot with the culinary union, right? But that was out of Vegas, or was that?
Well, the culinary union and Unite here, the union, they were squabbling with station casinos, and they're still fighting to get unionized, even though they voted for it a decade ago. It's just they've been fighting now for 20 some years to get unions in station casinos. The culinary union, because they were fighting with station casinos, they used their allies in New York and other places. But part of it too is I think at some point Sheldon, he got in his own mind, he disliked MMA. Mm-hmm. And I think he even beyond what they were asking him, they were trying to block and basically punish them in New York for what they're doing in Vegas. But I think even beyond that, he took it on his own.
Yeah. He was the main guy that kept us out of New York for so long.
Yeah, he's one of them.
Right.
Probably the number one person, but there was other issues with New York and UFC. Besides just and the final result too is I don't think the bill was great that they passed. It hurt a lot of other promotions because it was designed in a way that only the richest promotions could conduct.
Yep.
In New York. So
is it like that in other states too, or was that just a one-off thing with it being New York?
No, it's another. I mean, when MMA was legalized in Quebec too. Quebec. I'm pretty sure it's Quebec. One of the rules was it had to be done in a cage, not a ring. And so that prevented, and I believe too in that territory of Canada that one of the rules was it had to be an 8-sided cage, and only one company has the patent on an 8-sided cage.
Exactly. And wow.
So there's all these rules were constantly being written, expanding MMA, but often in a way that prevented other promotions from taking advantage of it.
Wow. Insane. So in summation, John, give us a quick rundown.
Well, a quick rundown is when people try to argue that MMA is not pro wrestling, they're wrong. MMA is pro wrestling. It's just the pro wrestling of the distant past where the fights, not 100% of the time maybe, but most of the time, enough of the times were real and not fake like they are today. So it's, in truth, it's actually much closer probably to the spirit of pro wrestling in the early days than what we have now.
And Dana White and Vince McMahon. Brothers, cousins, not even related.
They're very from a similar mindset, a similar school of business, and both guys. Honestly, I'm not going to say I'm a fan, but you have to say they've been successful at what they've tried to do, which is also probably not good, but still.
Okay, all right. I can dig it. I'm enlightened. I hope everybody else is too. I really like this topic. I'm sure we could go into this for hours on end, but we do try to condense everything into a nice little capsule for you guys. Once again, we will be running a mailbag soon. So if you have questions, please hit us up on Twitter. We're going to set up this mailbag with one of our emails. We just haven't decided yet, but you will know over the next 2 weeks when that mailbag will drop with a fresh address. So
yeah, it'll be Stephanie's.
It will not. It will be yours, or it will be a neutral email.
I'm gonna stuff it with my own questions then.
Tell me, what do you have on the horizon?
On the horizon, well, I'm probably going to be on If the Shoes Fit this week. So we got that. I got another victory lap coming up in the Care Don't Care. And we are talking, we don't know when, but soonish, there'll be the 50th episode of Show Money coming out. So we got to decide when we're going to record that, what the subjects are, but we're trying to think of something special for that. So that might be a mailbag too, but different, we do different types of questions on that than we do here. So
yeah,
we handle things different. That's the beauty of that show is it's about the business side generally like we do here, but it approaches it in a completely different way because, Paul Gift doesn't know what he's talking about. And Jason's drunk all the time. So it doesn't,
Listen to John, always the one in the golden light of the sun.
Yes, I didn't have to say that, but yes, that is true.
So, folks, John does have a brand new episode of Show Money out. That's Show Money number 49. So if you get over to anywhere you can find your podcast listening lists, we are always there because we are on all of the platforms. So make sure you check out that. And John, where can we find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter at Hey Not the Face, and that's really the only social media I do.
He has a Facebook, but only I'm allowed to know it. So.
Well, I do, but I haven't been on there in I don't know how long. So.
I know. I haven't been on mine in almost 2 years.
So I don't even know if it's still active, to tell you the truth.
Exactly. But on that fine note, we are going to wrap up the show. So until next time, remember, not the face.
Thank you for tuning in to this Bloody Elbow Presents production. To check out more of our content, subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is titled Bloody Elbow Presents. We're also on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn, Overcast, Player FM, and Amazon Music. Just search for Bloody Elbow Presents and you'll get brand new shows throughout the week, including Care Don't Care, the Level Change Podcast, the MMA Vivisection, the 6th Round Post-Fight Show, 6th Round Retro, the MMA Depressed Us, Crooklyn's Corner, exclusive fighter interviews, Show Money, guest podcasts, the Hey Not the Face podcast, and radio-style play-by-play for every UFC pay-per-view. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Bloody Elbow, Facebook at facebook.com/bloodyelbowblog, and as always, on bloodyelbow.com.